It seems like the request for a comparison video on the RTX 3060 Ti was even more popular than the request for the RTX 3070 video. So here it is finally, the RTX 3060 Ti buying guide that you've been waiting for. I'm not going to go into details about each card since that would take over an hour to explain, but I'm just going to compare all the different cards, and to explain how I do it, I always emphasize on the power limits as being important because the new GPUs these days can boost their clock speeds as high as they can as long as there's enough power and temperature headroom, which makes the boost clock specifications almost useless, and so the defining factors that actually affects performance is the power limit and cooler performance. Conveniently, the power limits are also easily checked for any cards by just checking their BIOS files, which are usually available on TechPowerUp's GPU BIOS database for almost every model. And shout out to TechPowerUp's Wizard, who makes great GPU reviews, for helping me out on checking the Asus cards BIOS because I had to download those from their website. Then the PCB quality is important as well, especially for the VRM or voltage regulator module, which is the circuit that feeds power to the GPU. And the VRM's current capabilities are important for anyone that wants to overclock, especially if it involves shunt mods that remove the power limits. But what does it mean for people who don't overclock? Well, the fact is that a stronger VRM will usually mean a higher quality VRM, because the components being used will need to be stronger. And because of that, usually the components are also more spread out in the load that they take, so they will usually last longer with all things equal compared to a lower quality and a weaker VRM. So first let's start with the power limits. It's a lot of data for 49 cards this time, so let's break it down into groups. This is because the cards with similar power limits will boost similarly, so a card in the same power limit class will be a good reference for the performance of all the cards in the same class. Firstly, let's focus on the stock power limit for default operation. Here you can see a lot of cards have the same power limits as the Nvidia Founders Edition card, more so than the RTX 3070 cards, which makes sense given that the 3060 Ti is a lower end model, and these cards will perform at default similarly to the Nvidia Founders Edition card. So you can just look at reviews of those to have an idea of their performance in games. You do not need to see each different model's in-game performance if they have similar power limits, as they will be roughly similar. One notable exception to this is the Asus TUF Gaming and Strix cards, which is kind of weird that they have a 200 watt power limit even though they're kind of a higher end card, but they also have some of the best coolers, so their boost clocks will be somewhat higher than other 200 watt class since their coolers are just a bit better than the rest of the cards. Although this crippling 200 watt power limit makes it almost pointless to get a TUF instead of a lower end Asus card in my opinion. Up next are the few 220 watt cards, where the performance is going to be the same as when you max out the power limit on the Founders Edition card. They'll have a slight benefit in performance compared to the 200 watt cards, and basically all of the cards with a 220 watt power limit have a very good cooler on them. So they will run a bit cooler and naturally boost a little higher because of that as well. A good card for reference of the performance of these cards is the Galax EX, which has been reviewed by some reviewers already. Then there are the 240 watt cards. These cards are all the highest performing RTX 3060 Ti custom models, and they all have top class coolers, so that'll give them a boost clock advantage over the lesser cards as well. The 40 watt power limit difference to the Founders Edition cards should have a meaningful performance advantage, as if we see the EVGA FTW3 Ultra review on TechPowerUp, its boost clock stays stable at the maximum possible boost frequency, which means at 240 watts there is enough power headroom for the RTX 3060 Ti GPU to boost indefinitely without throttling. Now let's focus on the maximum power limit, which will be very important for overclocking, as a higher power limit will let a higher overclock that can be sustained without power throttling. Take note as well how some of the OC versions of the cards have a higher power limit than the non-OC versions. So if you want to overclock, it might be best to get the OC versions of the cards only. Starting with the lowest end cards, these have zero power limit adjustment and max out at only 200 watts. The MSI Ventus 2X cards are kinda surprising in here because they are the only cards in the 200 watt power limit that have dual 8-pin power inputs, which is absolutely pointless if the power limit is only 200 watts, so the extra 8-pin is just an unnecessary gimmick, which makes no sense given that the Ventus 3X is a single 8-pin, so I don't really know what MSI were thinking here. This time there are a few other cards with 200W maximum power limits as well, so at least this time MSI is not alone in being the worst power limits. Then there are the 210W maximum power limit cards. These are all the same cards hardware wise. Palit just sells them under Gainward and as well as PNY rebranding them as their own model. This is slightly disappointing to see because these cards have coolers that are slightly better than the Founders Edition and good enough to easily at least let the same max power limit as the Nvidia Founders Edition card. So I really don't see a reason why they had to cripple those to 210W. This is the same situation with the Asus cards with 216W power limits. I do not understand why they did this. These cards have some great VRMs and yet they chose a max power limit that's 4W less than the Founders Edition. This is especially disappointing to see the Asus TUF Gaming, which has been a great choice for the 3070 and 3080 and 3090 as well, being crippled like this with the 3060 Ti. So with the Asus cards, they're all going to perform roughly the same thanks to that, with maybe the TUF Gaming having a few percent ahead in terms of performance because of the better cooler. But they're gonna mostly be similar in performance because of the power limit. Although with the Asus cards, because they have good VRMs, you could realistically just shunt mod them and remove the power limit entirely, and just take advantage of the good VRM and coolers that Asus put on them. Then there are the 220W max power limit cards, which are the same as the Nvidia Founders Edition. One thing to note is that all of these 200W to 220W cards, except for the MSI Ventus 2X, are all single 8-pin power inputs. And that clearly shows in how close they all are in default and max power limits. The one notable card is the Gigabyte Gaming OC, which at 230W is the highest power limit for a single 8-pin card. The cards above this are now all dual 8-pin power input cards. Now these cards start to have more varying and much higher power limits, starting with the Palit GamingPro and Gainward Phoenix, and the MSI Gaming X Trio at 250W. Honestly, this time 250W is fine even for the MSI Gaming X Trio, since that's enough for a good overclock on the RTX 3060 Ti. Then there are the 260W cards, which is nice to see the colorful Ultra OCV here, since it's one of the more affordable cards. The EVGA FTW3 here at 260W isn't as impressive as the other FTW3 cards, which usually are some of the highest power limit cards, since for the 3060 Ti, they're actually the same as the EVGA RTX 3070 XC3 hardware-wise, which is probably why they had to lower the power limit to this level. Then at 270W, there's the Maxsun iCraft OC, which makes sense given it's the same hardware as their 3070 version, followed by the Gigabyte cards. This time I don't see a reason to get the Gigabyte Aorus Master over the Gaming OC Pro, considering they have the same power limits. Then there are the Palit GamingPro OC and the Gainward Phoenix GS, which at 270W as well, should already be more than enough power headroom for a maximum overclock without throttling. Even so, there's the 290W colorful Advanced OCV right before the downright overkill colorful Vulcan OC and Asus Strix cards. Thankfully, Asus didn't cripple the non-OC Strix with a lower power limit. Still, at these overkill power limits, there is no way to even get close to the max power limits unless you do some voltage mods to the GPU. This ties in nicely to the VRM current capability of the cards, where usually a higher current capability comes hand in hand with a higher quality VRM that can last longer. To find out the card's VRM, I had to find reviews or just videos of people where they take the card apart, or view unboxings and reviews videos frame by frame to see through the cooler and see the VRM setup. Also, kudos to Colorful for just clearly putting in the VRM setup in their specifications. And although some DRMOS current rating would be nice, they're all using Nvidia reference 50A DRMOS just like their other cards, so it's totally fine. Let's start with the basic Nvidia reference spec 300A VRM cards, which are all using the same 6-phase VRM with 50A alpha and omega DRMOS. The 300A cards also only have a single 8-pin power input, which makes sense given their low power limits. These are all pretty unremarkable cards and are actually below the Founders Edition at 400A of VRM current. So for the 3060 Ti, the Founders Edition is actually a premium card and a pretty good bargain if bought at MSRP pricing. Then for some reason the MSI Ventus cards are at 315A, and this is because they decided to use a 7-phase VRM with 45A on semi DRMOS, which will be below 300A if they only use 6 phases. It seems like Nvidia's minimum requirements is 300 amps for the VRM, and because of that the Ventus is actually slightly better than the 300 amp cards. But 15 amp doesn't really make any difference, especially when their power limits are so low already, which is a more crippling factor than the VRM. Then there is the MSI Gaming X Trio, which MSI just added an extra phase to the Ventus VRM and make it an 8th phase to total 360 amps. This is still pretty disappointing for the Gaming X Trio as it's below even the Nvidia Founders Edition, but at least the Gaming X Trio isn't the worst anymore, and at 360 amps it's not that big of a difference to the Founders Edition. Still, I wouldn't get the MSI Gaming X Trio if you can get a better VRM card for a similar price point. So the next are the 400 amp VRM cards, and these are the same as the Founders Edition and should be plenty for even overclocking with shunt mods to remove the power limits. It is interesting to note that the Asus cards are all capable VRM wise, but for some reason Asus decided to cripple it all with a single 8-pin power input and a 216 watt power limit. With a single 8-pin, they should at least match Gigabyte's gaming OC card at 230 watts, which only has a 300 amp VRM. If you're an overclocker though, you can just shunt mod the Asus cards and remove the power limits to take advantage of their good VRM, which is probably a good way to use their tough gaming card. Next is the Gigabyte Aorus Master, which appears to use the same PCB as the 3070 Aorus Master, and so it has the same 450 amp VRM, which in this case is a lot for a 3060 Ti. It is still however beaten out by the Maxsun iCraft OC and the Palit GamingPro and Gainward Phoenix cards, which provide a 500 amp VRM and seems like a really great deal since you're getting the second best VRM setup on a 3060 Ti without paying anywhere close to an Asus Strix. Speaking of the Asus Strix, Asus again went crazy and put in a 600 amp VRM using 10 phases of expensive 60 amp Texas Instrument DR MOS, which is massive overkill but well pretty awesome to see. But it's still beaten out by the even more insane colorful Vulcan OCV at 700 amps. Using its 14 phase of 50 amp DR MOS, which is the same as on the RTX 3070 Vulcan OC cards and uses the same alpha and omega 50 amp DR MOS as on the other cards as well. The VRM on these cards will probably only start to be useful if you do some voltage mods to drive the power consumption up. Now for some temperature data. Same as before, I compiled the data for the usual reviewers that usually do the most thorough reviews, Guru 3D, Tech Power Up and Hexus. As well as I also added Hardware Lux reviews, which seems accurate, to be able to include the tough gaming here. I corrected all the review numbers to the Guru 3D numbers by calculating the average difference in temperature and noise readings between the reviews for the same cards compared to Guru 3Ds. And again, I discarded the MSI Gaming X Trio in this calculation because it's a bit way too inconsistent. So after calculating this, it turned out to be that Tech Power Up is about 1 Celsius warmer and 5 dBA quieter, and Hexus about 1 dBA noisier, which is actually in line with what I found in the 3070 comparison as well, so I think this method works pretty well. And for the Hardware Lux, it's about 2 degrees cooler and 1 dBA noisier. So with that correction in mind, I combined the data into one chart, picking the best results for each card. This should be accurate enough to see which cards perform better than one another and basically what you would do when you look at reviews yourself and try to cross-compare different cards from different reviews. So here we can see the Asus TUF Gaming manages to run at 58 degrees Celsius with only 34 dB of noise, which is mighty impressive, but this is why its single 8-pin and low power limit is very limiting considering how good the cooler is, which performs almost as well as a water cooler. Then the next is the Asus Strix, which also has the lowest temperatures even with a 240 watt power limit, and with the quiet BIOS, it's still 3 degrees Celsius cooler than the MSI card while only 2 dBA noisier. Gigabyte's triple slot Gaming OC Pro is also performing well here, but with a higher noise level. And keep in mind this is a different cooler than the non-Pro, which uses a smaller dual slot cooler taken from the RTX 3070 Eagle. Then the MSI Gaming X Trio also performs well in terms of cooling, especially with it being the quietest. I do have to point out however that this is the best MSI Gaming X Trio result from the Guru 3D review. But some of the other reviews are way worse than this, at over 6 degrees Celsius hotter for Hexus' sample and 4 degrees Celsius hotter for Tech Power Up's sample. So maybe MSI's use of a direct contact heat pipe again, causes inconsistent performance between samples, or it's just some testing variance, I do not know, but honestly it feels a bit too inconsistent. Then this is followed by the KFA2 or Galax EX card, which is an impressive result given that it's only a dual fan card dealing with 220 watts. Then the Zotac Twin Edge is here, which runs cooler than the Founders Edition, but it's not that impressive considering the Palit Dual runs at the same temperatures but with 2 dBA less noise. Also remember that Palit's dual card here is the same as the Gainward Ghost and PNY Accelerate cards. Then there is the Gigabyte Eagle OC, which seems to have the worst cooler since it's the same 200 watt power limit as the Founders Edition, but has a higher noise level for just 1 degree Celsius cooler temperatures. Then for the Palit GamingPro OC and EVGA FTW3 Ultra, they might look like they don't perform well, but remember they're dealing with 240 watts and using a smaller triple fan cooler than the top performers. So they're still putting in a good showing here, but maybe not the best choice for those looking for a quiet operation. Lastly, the Nvidia Founders Edition seems to be focused on silence, as it's the third quietest but runs at the hottest temperature, although at 69 degrees Celsius it's not even that hot, and it seems like the trend with the newer GPUs is to run super cold now for more boost clocks. Well, that's about all the cards that have proper reviews on them that I can compare with. So for the other cards, I'm going to rate their cooling based on their cooler design in terms of fan count and size, and from knowing how a similar design that has been reviewed performs. Take these ratings with a grain of salt since they're from my observations and not actual reviews of their performance, but it should still give you an idea of the kind of performance you can expect. I've also omitted the non-OC models of the same cards since they have the same coolers and basically the same hardware wise. The cards also aren't arranged in a particular order, so just pay attention to the tiers and not the exact position. Here the Asus Strix and colorful Vulcan OCV cards are without a doubt at the top in the newly added SS tier, since it has the same cooler as the higher end GPU versions. Then the S tier cards still have the best coolers money can buy without going too overboard like the Asus Strix. Although the MSI Gaming X Trio, like I said before, I'm not sure of how consistent their great performance is, seeing the variance in the reviews. Then for the Gigabyte cards, seems like they perform just slightly below the S tier cards, so they'll sit in A tier along with the Maxsun card, which seems to have the similar size cooler. Next are the B tier cards, which have triple fan coolers but are less massive than the A tier and above cards. They are still high-end designs that still perform well in terms of cooling and should be able to cool the 3060 Ti even when overclocked with a high power limit. Then for the C tier cards, these should be dual fan triple slot Asus cards, which should perform just under the triple fan B tier cards. The MSI Ventus 3X is here as well, despite the triple fans, because they're some of the cheapest triple fan cooler designs, and I keep seeing how people's Ventus 3X cards seem to underperform compared to other triple fan cards. Next are the D tier, which should perform similarly to the Nvidia Founders Edition cards. Some might run at lower temperatures, but are a bit noisier because of that. Lastly, there are the E tier cards, which should be below the Founders Edition in cooling performance, since they have physically smaller volumes of heatsink and so will be worse in performance. This is seen in the Zotac Twin Edge and Gigabyte Eagle reviews, where the cooler's performance is a bit subpar and below the Founders Edition. The Asus Dual Mini and the Leadtech Classic might be excused for the low performance because they are specialized designs, the Asus being a tiny dual fan dual slot card for SFF PCs and the Leadtech Classic being a blower design cooler. Finally, let's rank the card from first to last. This is my ranking based on the power limits, then the VRM quality and cooling performance of the cards. I usually value a higher power limit a lot since that usually drives up performance the most. So you might see a card with a lower performing cooler topping a higher performing cooler card, just because it has a higher power limit. Well, basically the rankings are great for those who care for maximum performance. I will put them into tiers as well, since that'll make it easier to find alternatives with similar performance if you can't find a card you want in stock, but have some other models in the same tier in stock. Starting with the SS tier, this time the Asus Strix aren't on top because the Vulcan OCV surpasses it, because it has a higher performance VRM, but they're both the very best with the largest cooler and the most powerful VRMs and the highest power limits. However, for a 3060 Ti, I'm not sure how much sense in buying these are. unless you're very big into overclocking, since a 3070 would probably be in the range of their price. Then in the S class, I would put the Gigabyte and Maxsun cards, which have great coolers and a high power limit with a good VRM design. For the A tier, I will put the colorful Advanced OCV card, which has the highest power limit in the A tier at 290 watts, followed by the Palit GamingPro OC and Phoenix GS cards, since they have a 270 watt power limit and some of the best VRMs. Then the MSI Gaming X Trio is here, because while it has a great S tier cooler that runs cool and quiet, the cooling is a bit inconsistent between reviews and the VRM and power limits are below the other cards in the tier, so I can't really put them on top, and I can't put the MSI on the S tier either. Then the next are the EVGA FTW3 cards, which is here because they're a bit underwhelming for an FTW card from EVGA, because they're reusing the XC3 design on the 3070. It's closely followed by the colorful Ultra OCV, Palit GamingPro, and Gainward Phoenix. Then I have to put the Asus TUF gaming cards in B tier because despite their S tier cooler, they have basically crippled it with a single 8-pin power input and a very low power limit, which means that the performance can't really touch the A tier cards since the boost clock advantage will only be from the cooler's great performance. This is followed by other good cooler but single 8-pin cards, which really restricts their power limits and so their performance as well. These are the cards like the Gigabyte Gaming OC, colorful Battleaxe NBV, Inno3D iChill X3, Galax EX, Nvidia Founders Edition, Asus KO OC, Asus KO, Asus Dual OC, and Asus Dual. Then there's the C tier cards, which I would only get if you need their form factor or if they're cheaper than the B tier cards. These cards have coolers worse than the Founders Edition, or at best just matching it, with the exception of the Ventus 3X, which has a triple fan cooler, but it is crippled by a super low power limit. The cards here are the Zotac Twin Edge OC, Zotac Twin Edge, Gigabyte Eagle OC, EVGA XC, MSI Ventus 3X OC, MSI Ventus 3X, Palit Dual OC, Gainward Ghost OC, PNY Accelerate Revel Epic X, Palit Dual, Gainward Ghost, Asus Dual Mini OC, and the Asus Dual Mini. Then lastly, I have the D tier or the Avoid tier, because unless you can get these at a much better deal than the C tier, I really wouldn't buy these. They have a locked 200 watt power limit and some of the worst coolers on the 3060 Ti. These are the Gigabyte Eagle, Galax One Click, PNY Uprising, Litec Hurricane, Inno3D Twin X2 OC, Inno3D Twin X2, MSI Ventus 2X OC, MSI Ventus 2X, MSI Twin Fan, and the Litec Classic Blower card, which is a niche product by itself. So for my personal pick of the best all-rounder this time, I would choose the Gigabyte Gaming OC Pro this time instead of the Asus TUF. It has everything you want, a great cooler, a great VRM, and a high power limit with dual 8-pin power inputs. The Asus Strix and colorful Vulcan are obviously the best ones out there, but they're a bit unnecessary for an RTX 3060 Ti. Especially since for the RTX 3060 Ti, sometimes you just want good value. And the best way to do that is actually to use my chart and pick the highest possible rank card for your price point. The Gigabyte here is just my personal pick, which seems to me like the best card if you want all the performance, while not going too overkill on the price. Well, that's about it for this buying guide. I hope you found it useful and enjoyed watching this video. If you do find it useful, maybe click the like button and help share the video to others looking for RTX 3060 Ti's, as that helps me out a lot. And if you own any of these cards, do comment down below about your experience and also ask any questions you have, and I'll try to answer every comment. Maybe also subscribe to my channel for more buying guides like this, which will come out for the AMD cards as well and the other Nvidia cards as well. And as well as for more videos of reviews, unboxings, and tech news. Thanks for watching.